I'm going to talk about number 4. Number 4 is the original Japanese Canadian settlement here on the West Coast. It's called Sunahama. I think that means west wind, but I'll have to check my resources. There were probably 20 or 30 families there, and that's where they built the first Japanese school. Quite a family. They built their own community. They fished, and then in the winter they would go back to Steveston because that's where the temple was. But they summered here, and then eventually they stopped toing and froing, and then they just stayed here the whole time. So they were the original head of the bay pioneers. They chose the bay, head of the bay, because it provided security for their boats and for themselves. They were not terribly encouraged to stay over in Ucluelet with the settlers. They were more comfortable for both sides to be separate. So that's what happened. So in Ucluelet, the 7 villages that came up were all separated according to kin. Japanese families are extremely limited in terms of their social development, so they stick together. So cousins and uncles and aunts and etc. etc. It's sort of like a small little ghetto. So that's Sunahama, number 4. The Japanese settlements that popped up in the mouth of the Ucluelet Harbour, the headwaters, were all sort of populated by extended families. And the Bungee people were well known for their ability to not only fish, they ended up staying most of the winter. They grew vegetables. They were very much part of the community. I'm not sure what Bungee means, but I think that was probably the family name. And the bay would indicate that it was a good place for them to be able to anchor and manage their boats. All these little settlements that happened in Ucluelet Harbour had to do, one, with the security of their boats, and then secondly, their ability to access water on land. So probably there was a water source at Bungee. I think Bungee means water. Cool. So it was probably the place where they made tofu from, they would bring rice over from Japan, and they would soak the rice in water, and then they would make tofu. But they needed really good, clear, clean water for that. So I think the Bungee people were quite enterprising. They provided the rest of the group with some food stuff.
Yeah, it's a place, Yellow Cedar Ogre, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is so cool.
You don't care?
He said it's the spot of a mythological story of a yellow cedar ogre. So is there an actual yellow cedar ogre story?
Yeah.
Is it something you can tell, or would you prefer not to?
I think we're still figuring it out. We're trying to find the story right now. Yeah. We're still just learning ourselves. So well, I am.
No, I only learned about it from late Lawrence Jack.
Really?
Yeah, he told me before he passed away.
Really? So would he have passed it on to his oldest son, do you think?
He did, I don't know if he would do it.
Okay.
Seems like they didn't retain problem.
There's references to it in like early stories, like early 1900s. It's in there was a big yellow cedar mass, which we actually have it, in our library over there, so.
Next little settlement, number 2 on the list, Shimizu Bay. And the family were the people that provisioned the Japanese Canadians who were here. They were entrepreneurs. They had a store and they had access to a great big fishing type vessel that brought supplies from Vancouver and Victoria. So they brought in things like rice and soy sauce and things that a person could not purchase here in Ucluelet. So the Shimizus also had a store at Spring Cove, one of the 3 stores at Spring Cove, and they kept the West Coast people in groceries. They stocked fishing gear, and they were generally speaking the provisioners for the whole coast. The Shimizu family eventually settled all over Vancouver Island. You'll find them in Victoria, in Nanaimo, running restaurants, and even here in Ucluelet now with the restaurant we call Howlers. Amy Shimizu is one of the Shimizu family from a long time ago. So it would be interesting to talk to her about the history of the Shimizu family on the West Coast. It's massive. It's a big, I would say they were royalty in terms of being able to keep the civilization going with food. You know how important food is to everybody's culture. Well, the Shimizu family boat, they're big packer, but provision in Seattle, provision in San Francisco, and then come up the coast and supply things like Christmas and particularly New Year's, because that was festival time. Right. So they still are a very important commercial cog in BC politics, the Japanese Canadian community. There's Shimizus all over BC.
So your grandfather, your great grandfather, he owned a lot out here or something. Yeah. Can you point out a prop? Can you kind of understand where here? Over here. Really? On the edge?
Wow.
So Burt Mac lived where?
This area later.
Right, right. Now,
Grandfather. Well, these people are-
okay. And that, of course, was well before the Japanese came. That was before Hakota Bay. Oh, they were, okay. Okay. Oh, that's
For the 3 piece of property, why, on it. We're here. 500 acres.
500 acres? Wow.
Did you pass it on to grandmother or?
It was a highly prized piece of property, Dakota Bay, because of the location close to the ocean, right? And you've got Spring Cove right over there, and Spring Cove had provisions. But Dakota Bay here had 13 really deep pocket families. They were well-to-do. Of all the community of Japanese Canadians in Ucluelet, they were probably had the deepest pockets. And but they had also they wanted to purchase the land, but then WW2 came and you can see parts of the lagoon over here on High Focus. High Focus was originally purchased by a Japanese Canadian fisherman, and his family are the Mitsuis, and the Mitsuis still live here in Ucluelet. But you've heard of Emerald Mitsui. It was her uncle that bought High Focus before World War One. So we're talking 1900s. He bought High Focus. He kept it for his family. His family was coming from Japan. He enrolled as a soldier in the Canadian Army and fought in World War One. And when he came back, they had sold his land to somebody else. And that's why High Focus has had many names. And I spoke to the Mitsui family because I thought they might want to do something about the claim. But they're in Alberta and they're very peaceful and they don't want to upset anybody right now. So that's the end of that story. To be a place for the Mitsui family to have houses and bring up their families. Mr. Mitsui, who owned High Focus, was the oldest of 5 males, and he wanted to bring all his brothers together, and they thought High Focus was a great place because on top there's a lagoon. Spring Cove was probably the first area which was used by vessels before 1900. There's a history of Russian and Chinese great big factory boats coming over to collect seal pelts and otter pelts to take back to Russia and to China. And that happened probably before Canada was confederated. So before 1860, they used this part of the cove here. There was a wonderful wooden structure here. The boats would come in and tie up, and other small boats with pelts would come. First Nations canoes would come with whale blubber, with otter, sea lions, but mostly seals. Seals were the gold trade. And that continued for some time until the conservation took over. They ran out of, they took all the animals. They were gone. The pelt population was so popular in Asia and China, and at the same time, England had shooting black bears around here for the hats that the Grenadier Guards wear and the Buckingham Palace Guards. So those are all BC bears on top of everybody's heads. You know, with Charles's coronation, did you see all those black big hats? Those are BC bears. And at the same time, here in Spring Cove, which was the first place to be utilized as a commercial fishery. And pretty soon after the animal trade died down, the commercial business came. And right here where you see remnants of the war was the famous Sager's Country Store. You all watched, what's the name of the CBC Country Store? Similar. The Sagers were a family from Victoria. They're still in Victoria. And George has progeny still alive. He's got a grandson, George the Fourth. And when my cousin Doug had his passing ceremony, George the Fourth Sager came to bring blessings to the passing of my cousin Doug. And he left a trove of information, pictures, photographs, which are at the museum now. So you can see pictures of this store here. And in there was a tea house. You could walk down from Ucluelet, Port to Alberta, and there was a tea house over there. And there's a lady right now who's residing in our seniors home. And she was a person who served tea at the tea house. Someone's got to talk to her about her Port Albion existence and her serving high tea for the hoity-toity of Ucluelet to come down and have high tea and crumpets over there. See where the finance are. And then BC Packers moved in, and then see where Tom's got his boat anchored there. We had at one time 4 major fish companies here in this enclosed area. BC Packers, Canadian Fish, Todd Brothers, Nelson Brothers. They were all fish brokers. And once a week, the big boats would come from Seattle, San Francisco, load up the catch for that week, and then go up to Alberta and unload their cargo. And the train would take the fish by train to Nanaimo on these black bull ferries or whatever it was called in those days, and on to Victoria, Vancouver, and Seattle. So that was the history of Spring Cove. We've got photographs in Aunt Mary's albums of this whole area, 400 boats, little ones. Later on, the trawlers came. Then during the war, 1941, this became a Army Air Force base. And there were 200 men stationed on the green where you had the party last week. There were structures all over Spring Cove, and the Air Force was here. They came probably about 1945, and they stayed until 1948. They were here for 3 years, and they built infrastructure all over. As little kids, we used to play, on the green, and we'd find ammunition, we'd find bullets, we'd find remnants of rifles and shotguns, and the houses were interesting. The structures were interesting because the house that my family grew up in was a medical house. So it was a very well built house. The shack that you can see through the trees there, that was for the commanding officer. He had his own. Well, here comes a big boat coming in now.
Yeah.
Good shot. Right on this beach here, there was a officer's mess, great big red building where people could go and dance and get drinks. So it was a fully operational Air Force base. Then 1949, the government lifted all the restrictions, right? And we could all come back to BC. They left. It was abandoned. And my family wanted to come back here because they're fishing. And so they came back looking for a place to stay. They were not welcome in Tofino. They were met with gunfire. So they came to Ucluelet, and they got help from Guy's family and spent the first winter with provisions from Itatsu, fish and all sorts of things. So that's a connection between Guy and me. Is the they looked after our family. You looked after the Kimoto. We've never forgotten that. Yeah. I had hooligan grease instead of butter growing up as a kid. Yeah. And that's when my family arrived in this area in 1949. And my dad and his 6 brothers had their boats all tied up in here. And every day they went fishing.